Welcome to Consciousness, the DSR Network podcast focusing on the artificial intelligence revolution, politics, and policy.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Consciousness. I'm David Rothkopf. And as you know, each and every week we talk about emerging issues with regard to artificial intelligence. And we are very glad to have with us today Dr. Chinasa Okolo, who's a computer scientist and a Brookings Institution fellow specializing in AI governance and ethics. How are you doing today, Chinasa?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on the show.
Very, very glad to have you with us. Each week around here, we talk about a variety of issues, mostly that have to do with AI and public policy. And there's a whole set of issues that I'm particularly interested in because I've spent most of my career dealing with emerging markets and the issues associated with emerging markets. And just when you think you know what those are, a whole new set of issues emerge, right? And I think one way to look at it is that the past 250 years of world history have been spent getting the Industrial Revolution to everybody.
Yes.
And we kind of are doing that. It's not that everybody's benefiting in the same way, but we've kind of gotten there. And all of a sudden, the next one is starting. And that when I look at artificial intelligence, I don't see it as a vertical thing, one particular thing. I see it as something that affects all aspects of society in a variety of ways. And that creates all sorts of challenges for countries that want to harness AI, want to protect themselves from AI, want to understand AI. And it looks like once again we're in one of those situations where there are a handful of countries that are far out in the lead. There are 20 or 30 countries that are playing in the game. And then the rest of the world is lagging far, far behind because they lack the manpower, they lack energy, they lack access to chips, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the sort of big overarching question here is, does this lead you to foresee a period in which we have a new kind of digital divide?
Most definitely. Yeah, a lot of people, or some people have coined this as the AI divide, and I'm actively doing research into this topic, particularly for a report that I'm working on with the United Kingdom government, the International Scientific Report on the safety of advanced AI. And so for the interim report that was published earlier this year, in May, I actually had the opportunity to write a section that detailed the AI divide. And we're actually working on the final report that aims to be released next year before the AI Action Summit in Paris. And so, this digital divide is definitely entwined, with this new AI divide, but also the introduction of tools like generative AI have just essentially added a whole new dimension to it because we're seeing, I would say, such a chasm or just many disparities in terms of how countries in the global north, such as the UK, within the EU and also the US, have been able to take such a wide or a very far leap in AI development versus countries in the global south, who, aside from China, depends on whether or not you count them in the global south, but who've barely been able to make, I would say, a dent. And when we think about the frontier of AI.
When I talk to leaders from around the world, I talked to a very senior person from a very big country in the emerging world just a couple of weeks ago. And he was saying he was a little older. He was even a little older than me. And he was saying, when I look at AI, I think of NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. He says, because what happened was the US and Russia were in this arms race, and they put together a global treaty, which gave them some sort of balance, but it also locked most of the world out. And he says, when I look at AI, what I worry about is that the US and China are going to be in a kind of AI tech arms race. Okay. And that's one kind of problem because we have to deal with one side or the other trying to influence us. But that we're worried that what's going to happen is that we're going to get global regimes that make it much harder for the emerging world to keep up or even to play in the game. What's your sense of that?
Oh yeah, I definitely see that playing out. And, there's a really interesting new dynamic that is occurring within this AI race between the US and China. It's also another version or another race that's focused on AI influence, particularly in emerging markets or, the global South countries. And so we've seen how China has made, really significant investments in traditional infrastructure as it pertains to transportation, electricity, et cetera. And now we're starting, to see how this could potentially play out in China, helping countries in the global South, other countries in the global South, develop this critical infrastructure needed to develop, frontier and large-scale AI models. And the U.S. is honestly, I would say, from conversations I've had in many roundtables or panels, that the U.S. is concerned about this and is trying to understand how they can have an influence somehow in this AI race globally.
Yeah, I mean, China just held an AI in the Global South meeting a couple, 2-3 weeks ago, right? When you look at what a country needs, when we do development science in the sense of development, we talk about capacity and we talk about capacity building. Yeah. And when I think about capacity with regard to AI, there are a few kinds of capacity that are important. You need to have brain power. You need people who understand it. You need to have the technology itself, the compute. You need to have the energy to run the compute, which is very energy intensive. The water to cool it. You need the natural resources for it, and you also need the regulatory framework. Correct. Yeah. Which means you actually need to have government officials who understand AI. And to me, this is like a particular area of problem because you get into what I used to call TV repairman syndrome. And what I mean by TV repairman syndrome is you used to, in the olden days, your TV would break and you'd bring it to the TV repairman and he would open the back and he'd look at it and he'd say, you need to fix these things. And you don't know how a TV works. So you have to say yes. And when you're running, if you're a policymaker and you don't understand AI, then some guy from the US or some guy from China or some guy from someplace else comes to your country and says, this is what you need. And there isn't, it seems to me, a big base of policymakers who actually understand. Is that a problem in your mind?
Oh, most definitely. And I think, this problem is persistent throughout many countries in the global South, but also in the U.S. as well. I think that, compared to many other countries, we're starting to see, U.S. policymakers and also their respective staffers, gain the capacity to have this specific domain knowledge about AI and other emerging technologies like quantum, for example. And so, however, I think that there still is, a debate in terms of how much people need to exactly know about AI to regulate it. And I think that, we're still figuring it out, And so, but I think that this fundamental knowledge about its respective capacities and its, limitations more specifically is really important to understand.
Yeah, I mean, well, what we see in the U.S., for example, is when I look at the U.S. government, there's an executive order on AI, which is kind of a wishful thinking document. It kind of says, well, everybody should get up to speed on this and everybody should be doing this. And we should deal with the big problem issues when they emerge, but we don't really know what they are. And then they hold hearings in the Congress and AI people come in and they say, oh, well, look, what you guys here in this Congress, you should focus on not having AI destroy the whole planet. And they don't say you should really focus on regulating our companies and making sure that we don't have algorithmic biases, or making sure that we don't, I don't know, get too rich and powerful and dominate, and that's that TV repairman syndrome, right? That's them coming in, and members of Congress who, are not sure what the internet is, nodding and being led astray. To what extent are you seeing that elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, honestly, not to the scale as I see in the US, honestly, just because these frontier AI companies are based in the US, and they also, unfortunately, have a very significant influence on policymaking in general. And so I think this will have a very large downstream effect on, how robust AI legislation can be in the US. But within, global South countries as well, I think that, ethics are a concern, to some. Honestly, I think the framing of AI is basically as something that can leapfrog development and help address many of the gaps that have occurred. And so at many times, I don't necessarily see ethics, come to mind, because I think governments, especially, those that have experienced, very significant difficulties in, addressing problems in healthcare, education, agriculture, for example, are really trying to scramble in ways to ensure that they don't, stifle the AI development. And so I think sometimes this comes at a cost of ethics and, transparency and responsible AI in general. So, but these are things that these countries will still have to be quite aware of.
Within ethics, there's so many issues to address, but we can get to perhaps privacy in a minute. But this issue, which I know you've done some work on with regard to algorithmic biases, AI sort of ingests culture. It ingests the culture of the programmers who create it. It also ingests the culture of the material it's trained on. It imposes on the user vast numbers of logical progressions that may make sense in one culture and may not make sense in another culture. So that, there can be a lot of hidden problems. You can't just buy the box and think that it's going to treat you the way the person sitting next to you is going to treat you. And I'm just wondering, what do you think can be done to mitigate this?
Mm-hmm. I think just honestly, or, more generally, more inclusive approaches to AI development. We see that this development of these large scale models are primarily centered in, just a few regions of the world. And, many companies like Google, for example, they do have offices in African countries, in Asian countries, and Latin American countries. But we still see, many failures in this inclusiveness or representation of their AI models. And I think this is also a bit of a capitalist problem, because, these countries understand that, speakers of certain languages or that are in certain regions are not going to provide us the economic benefit of using our tools and models, versus other users that are in European countries or in, North America, for example. So I think this is a reason or something that drives this inequality or underrepresentation that we see. But I think it will be increasingly important as these tools scale and as they continue to be adopted within, different countries. Because, for example, Indian users are one of I believe the top most adopters of tools like ChatGPT. And the second, highest of these users is in Kenya. And so we're seeing global South countries increasingly use these tools and also want to be included in them. And so this will become a very important issue.
Well, what about homegrown AI? I mean, what about the need to, if this is the milieu in which a lot of the thinking of the planet is going to get done, the preparatory thinking, not the final, work, but still a lot of it. Isn't it important that there be more homegrown elements?
Yeah, actually, I think, some of the issues that I mentioned before are reasons why these grassroots homegrown AI initiatives are so important, because they're led by people who are familiar with the context and also, for the most part, have the interest and needs of local communities at mind. And within Africa, I always speak to so many different initiatives happening, particularly within the natural language processing space, because these workers, these researchers, these developers, have taken on tasks that these large companies, basically did not want to address. And they've had significant impact in, publishing in premier conferences, also startups, spin-offs into startups that are actively addressing these problems, and also lots of academic research labs that have, secured millions in funding from external partners to help advance this work. And so I also see this happening, really well in Indian country and in India, and then also, in Latin America as well. And so I think this is really important, and also democratizing how AI, benefits people that are not, in Western countries or from affluent backgrounds.
Give me an example of something that they would take up that the bigger companies weren't dealing with back home, that needed dealing with, just for the listener to understand.
Yeah, most definitely. So basically just, let's say we're in South Africa, for example, Zulu is one of the, most widely spoken languages in the country, along with others like Sesotho and, Setswana, but these languages have not been represented, in tools like, Google Translates, Siri, which is probably one of the most, I would say, limited like AI applications, and also, tools like ChatGPT, for example. And even if they are represented, these translations or, I'd say the output that's represented from them is either incorrect, doesn't necessarily understand the nuances of these languages, or can be very like archaic, because a lot of the training data for many African languages and other indigenous languages around the globe is actually captured in Bibles, due to the spread of missionary work. And so again, this language is not representative, of, like modern, I say nuances and slang, for example. And so these are initiatives that African researchers in particular have taken up.
Great example. Another thing that I see these countries struggling with is the issue of data or digital sovereignty. Like whose cloud is it? And are we in, is Google going to come to my country? And I know Google, when it comes to a country, says, well, we got 4 different flavors of cloud, and you could be in the big cloud with everybody. We can build one for you that we can manage. We can build one for you where you hold the key and we can't get in it even. What do you want? But then a lot of the countries are like, yeah, but what are the back doors? We've seen what's happened in the past. Are we sort of giving our national jewels? Because, data is an asset for companies, but it's also a national security property of a state. Mm-hmm. How do you see that being dealt with, and do you see people struggling with it?
Yeah, data is very important and honestly, fundamental to AI development. And so I think that's why, efforts like data privacy protections are essential to ensuring that AI is regulated very well. Unfortunately, in the US, we don't have a federal-wide data, protection legislation, and a lot of these efforts have been led by states like California, who've been doing, in my opinion, a really great job on both the data protection and also AI legislation efforts. But more broadly, as when we think about digital sovereignty or, and all the other issues that come across this, I think that, a lot of countries in the global South, particularly, want to be able to have, I would say, full reign in terms of how they develop AI, but then also how AI, benefits their respective countries. And I think that will be important for these issues to increase because in particular, we're seeing new initiatives every day. For example, initiative release announced by the State Department last week, for this global inclusivity partnership on AI. And we're seeing, these premier frontier AI companies leading this effort. And it's really hard to understand, what are their intentions in this process as well. And so I'll be interested to see how these initiatives and others evolve.
Oh, come on. You know what their intentions are.
Yes.
It's the bottom line, right? They're trying to sell things. When they say inclusivity, they mean buy our product.
Exactly.
When countries that are out of the AI mainstream say inclusivity, they say help us build an AI roadmap so we can have AI independence and not AI dependence. What do you think are the critical elements on an AI roadmap for developing countries that assure their independence?
I think something that will be really important. It primarily revolves around like the human capital area, or the skilled talent, is because there's so many opportunities, and also in many countries in Africa, particularly, which is technically the youngest continent, on the planet. We have such a large base of youth that are underemployed, also, which has many downstream effects on the ability for the economies within these countries to scale. And so I think that ensuring that these students are this youth have access to educational opportunities, particularly like significant educational opportunities, and also are able to have job opportunities and other even entrepreneurship opportunities to stay within their countries and to build their respective AI ecosystems there, will be very important. And so as we consider the education side of things, I think there are also other areas. Obviously, governance will be very important. I know, again, many countries in the global south are debating in terms of like how much regulation they need to have on AI in ways that don't necessarily stifle this development. But again, these tools are being exported and also imported, primarily imported. And so we really have to ensure that these protections are in place, and also that there are protections that allow local AI innovation to scale.
Well, there are also sort of philosophical foundations. I'll often talk to people about AI and say, when the Industrial Revolution started, things moved slowly enough that we could have a big philosophical debate about the organization of society. The Industrial Revolution, you could say, started, in the 18th century. 1776, which is a big year in the U.S., was the first year that the year that James Watt patented one of his steam engines. And at the same time, Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. And we started talking about that, right? But it wasn't until 40, 50, 60 years later that Karl Marx started saying, no, there's another way to do this, because I'm seeing exploitation. And AI is happening so fast, but it changes social structures in a profound way. One thing that worries me, while everybody's talking about a singularity and AI killing everybody on the planet, to me, the thing that I think is going to happen first is labor force dislocation and much more rapidly growing inequality.
Yes.
Because the AI haves are necessarily going to do better at the stock market. They're necessarily going to do better in competitive business.
Right.
They're necessarily going to want to keep a competitive edge over the people they're competing with. Exactly. And if inequality has accelerated worldwide over the past 40 years, this could launch it to the stratosphere. That, on the other hand, could produce backlash. Much like you saw sometime between Adam Smith and Karl Marx. What do you think about that element of this?
Yeah, I think, this is obviously a very serious question when we think about inequality overall. And I think that, obviously it has existed outside of AI development. But again, we're seeing how the introduction of tools like generative AI particularly have basically exacerbated this issue. And for me, I just think that I don't see any incentive for this to slow down. And honestly, when we think about who's profiting from AI, it's only honestly like a very few, amount of companies in general. I think when we think about the actual like application layer, OpenAI is probably at the top. And then when we think about the hardware, obviously NVIDIA, and then, other chip companies, TSMC, for example, ASM, and others. And so even within, I would say, like the actual ability for people to significantly, economically benefit from AI, it's also like there's also, an unequal standing there as well.
Um, as you were talking, I was thinking, I was at 2, 3 years ago, I was sitting with some people at the World Bank meeting,
Mm-hmm.
and there was an African minister of economy there.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, well, there was some Indians and some others. And he said, well, you better be ready because our big job boom is going to be, we're going to start doing all the call centers that were in India. And I sort of shook my head, and there were a couple other people who shook their head and said, no, that's not actually happening. AI is going to do the call centers. A lot of the jobs that were sort of at the bottom of the food chain were going to do the call centers. And you could see a lot of those being displaced. Now, having said that, based on what you were just talking about, another phenomenon that could take place that I don't think people fully get is that you could have large populations of people who are fairly underschooled, who could be propped up by AI, who could, the AI could help them be 100 times, 1,000 times more productive than they could have been with their amount of education. Right. Now, again, there's an ethical problem.
Yes.
Shouldn't you educate them? But on the other hand, they have a problem. Shouldn't you feed me? Mm-hmm. And there's a tension there. What about that?
Yeah. A very big tension. And I think that we still have to be, I would say, reasonable when we understand, I would say, the respective capacities of AI in these cases, to help these underskilled people, because I think that, digital literacy is an issue, AI literacy is an issue. And so, there's this, I guess, ethos or like saying going around that, people that are able to leverage AI will advance, those that do not or are not able to take advantage of it. And it's still hard to say, honestly, because, for example, like AI cannot replace many, I would say, like functions of manufacturing and also field work, for example, picking crops. I think that's probably like the use case I don't see AI replacing anytime soon. And so, but I do think there are opportunities, but global South countries really have to focus on the basics. And I think there are other ways that AI can help advance economies. But for me, it's still, I wouldn't suggest it as a solution because, you can suggest AI, I would say, a socioeconomically disadvantaged person using these tools, but if they don't have access to a smartphone, access to internet, access to electricity, then like they're not going to be able to take advantage, of AI overall. And so, it's still a very mixed bag on my end.
Well, all the defense contractors who live within 20 miles of me are busy working on creating autonomous weapons platforms, and those will learn how to pick crops. But you don't have to. It's not going to happen right away. But exactly. I suspect that's going to happen to some degree. I find this conversation super interesting, and I hope we can talk to you again sometime. But we've got just a few minutes left, and I was wondering, maybe you could talk for a minute or two about the work you're doing right now. Like, what are your priorities in your life?
Yeah, sure. So for me, I would say the biggest priority I have is really understanding how African governments can best enable effective AI and data governance. And so I'm really focused on the data governance side because, African countries are still very early in terms of implementing and developing AI strategies. But and also just given the fundamental role of data in AI development, I think there are many issues that persist, within existing data governance, I would say, frameworks throughout the continent. And so I have some research that was commissioned by the United Nations and will be actually published very soon in the African Journal for Sustainable Development. And then also another issue that I'm really interested in is really understanding like the impact of generative AI on disinformation, particularly, in African context, and also its impact on, I would say, democratic processes like elections. And also there's a really interesting, I would say, phenomenon of AI and generative AI particularly having an impact on coups, which have increased very heavily, particularly within Saharan Africa. And so really trying to understand these issues and then also think about ways in terms of mitigation strategies, but also ways to enable citizens and just the general public with, effective tools to understand these issues and also increase their respective voice and democracy overall.
It's interesting to me because those are, first of all, very important issues. But they to go back to that philosophical or ethical set of questions. It gets to some of the divides that already exist in the world, and that impact both of those questions. So, for example, I will say, and this is oversimplification, but that there's sort of three theories of data privacy that also impact on the treatment of data more broadly, right? In the United States, and this all started with the internet. It started pre-AI, but the United States has a kind of opt-out policy, which is that if you don't want your data to go to a big company, you have to say it can't go. Mm-hmm. Europe has a kind of opt-in policy, which is the company can't have your data about you until you tell it can. And then in China, the state, the internet and the AI verse is the domain of the state. The state gets to have all of it. Mm-hmm. And there are some areas in which this gives China, for example, a big advantage. Like if they want to collect everybody's DNA data, they can, and that could help them with medical advances. But if they, in terms of competitive economy or, protecting certain kinds of data, countries around the world may have an advantage over them or freedom of access to information. The Chinese censor. Well, if you start censoring your training data, it's going to be dumber than less censored training data. But what is interesting to me with your work is African governments have to make those choices now as they pertain to AI. And of course, there's a whole set of parallel implications for things like the role of the state in monitoring data about you, about CCTV data, facial recognition data, and so forth, and the role of the state in things like disinformation. Mm-hmm. Do you see a trend among African states as to what models they're being drawn to?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question. And when you mentioned China, I think honestly, I could note, some African countries that, are taking similar approaches. They may not be as pronounced, but this suppression does happen outside of AI. And there was an interesting case in Nigeria recently where there were surveillance tools that were basically adopted by the government, but were actually being abused by politicians to spy on their enemies and also to spy on their lovers. And so I thought this was a very interesting use case, but there are other African countries also are rapidly adopting these surveillance tools from China, Israel, the US, EU, et cetera. And they're rapidly, actively using them, to spy on journalists and also to suppress dissent. And we've seen a lot of active social movements across the continent over the past couple months or the past year. And these tools are, rapidly being adopted and also used in negative ways. And so I think that this Chinese model, is something that is being adopted, unfortunately, and would love to see an opt-in happen. But I don't think that, I don't foresee that, within many African countries.
Yeah. It's a mistake to define modern developments in the context of past models. But with AI, it always looks like you could take those past models and accelerate or magnify the results. Going back to Karl Marx, if you take the owners of capital and the owners of the means of production, they tend to dominate the economy. Well, if the owners of capital own the AI means of production, they will dominate it much more rapidly and more greatly. Yes. Or if you take George Orwell, and he talks about Big Brother, well, he ain't seen nothing yet, because there's just so much more data and so much more ability to process so much more of it, so much more quickly. Yes. And so as you look at this era, what's your hope, fear, balance?
Something that I'm very hopeful about is there's been such an increased consciousness more generally about the negative impacts of AI, and I think this has also trickled down into data. And so every day I'm seeing posts, or just like mentions about how to protect your data. And, companies are being very sly because they're trying to train their own respective generative AI models. And we're seeing, again, just really seeing people understand that their data has value and there are ways that they can protect it. And so I would say that's probably my hope. My fear is that, with the growing influence of tech and again, with their growing need, to obtain data, with all these estimates saying that these big tech companies are going to run out of data by 2026. Honestly, they're going to run out of Western data. And so Africa is going to be the next big frontier. Asia is going to be the next big frontier. Latin America, the Caribbean, Oceania. And so this exploitation is only, going to spread. And if, these countries don't have sufficient protections in place, then I am very worried about what implications this has both internationally, but also, for geopolitics as well. And so those are my hopes and concerns.
Well, I have to tell you, my hopes have gone up talking to you.
Thank you.
I'm very glad that you're dealing with some of these issues and that there are moves afoot. I hope we can talk more because we're really interested in building out things that can help emerging economies build their roadmaps to AI.
Yeah.
And I think we're in the very early days of that. And so that actually creates an opportunity because there can be good roadmaps and not so good ones. And there's a chance to get in there with the good ones. So hopefully we'll invite you back and you'll come. But for now, we're very grateful to you, Chinasa, for joining us. Chinasa Okolo's work is, you can find it on the internet. She was in the Time 100, the 2024 Time 100. Congratulations. And so follow her work. And of course, follow us here at Silla Consciousness every week as we keep talking about these things on the DSR network. Until our next show, thanks very much. Thank you, Chinasa, and bye-bye.